Well, thank you very much. My name is Peter Culp. I'm a partner in the Phoenix office of Squire Patton Boggs. I've been involved with Colorado River issues now for, uh, I don't even really know, 15 years, something like that. A substantial portion of which has been involved with working towards an international agreement between the United States and Mexico with regard to the Colorado River Delta, as well as some other issues, which is what we're going to talk about today. I've got the sort of boring part of this presentation. I'm mostly going to provide some background to sort of set up what you're going to hear from Jennifer Pitt and Osfel Hinojosa down the road here, who are going to talk about the sort of fun parts of this agreement, the pulse flow and a lot of the restoration efforts that have been going on. But I will give you some background on just sort of what led to these negotiations, how the negotiations proceeded, some of the key provisions of the agreement as it was negotiated, and then give a little thought about why this agreement really matters. It's important for the environment. I think it's also important to the border relationship and to the broader management of water in the Colorado River. So, so obviously we're talking about, I guess I've got a laser here somewhere. The middle button, there we go. So we're talking here about the Colorado River Delta region at the very base of the Colorado. As I'm sure you all know, the United States, through the development of the Colorado River, ultimately developed around 90% of the water supply of the Colorado River for its own use, leaving Mexico with just around 10% of what it has historically received. And actually, for many, many years, the United States resisted even providing any allocation of water to Mexico at all. That changed during the middle of World War II with the negotiation of the U.S.-Mexico treaty, which governed both the Colorado River and the Rio Grande. Under that treaty, Mexico was provided 1.5 million acre-feet of water on an annual basis, plus theoretically an allocation of surplus, which they had actually never really received, and had committed to some somewhat vague terms about how that would work in the event that there wasn't enough water. And this became a major issue actually in the negotiations, but in which they would share with the United States proportionately, quote unquote, in times of extraordinary drought, quote unquote, neither of which were actually defined or really understood. That same treaty, though, merged some older border commissions into the International Boundary and Water Commission, of which there's a U.S. section and a Mexican section under the State Department and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then later, although the treaty itself never included a water quality requirement, there were some significant controversies through the 1960s and 1970s over water quality, particularly increasing salinity, which led to what was known as Minute 242, which introduced a water quality requirement into the treaty and led the United States to divert some very highly saline drainage water down via another canal into Mexico, which ultimately created the Cienega de Santa Clara Marsh. So you've got some context here. This is the way in which water is ultimately delivered to Mexico, that 10% that they actually get. We deliver what's effectively pretty fresh water at the northerly international boundary where Mexico, California, and Arizona come together at Morelos Dam, which you'll see in Jennifer's presentation on the pulse flow. The remainder of their water we deliver at the SIB, southerly international boundary, as essentially highly saline and not particularly useful drainage water coming off of the Yuma area of Arizona. Mexico mixes that water together for application to crops throughout the Mexicali Valley. That water is then distributed throughout the Mexicali Valley farming area through a whole series of canals and then drains which carry away drainage water, as well as supporting some urban areas, San Luis, which is mostly supported by groundwater, the city of Mexicali, and then a pipeline that runs over to the city of Tijuana on the Pacific coast. And Mexico also importantly receives a tremendous amount of water from groundwater pumping through a very extensive well field, as you can see, throughout the Mexicali Valley, as well as a international well field. There's some wells on the U.S. side here as well that's now regulated under the Minute 242 agreement. But what's important to understand here is that although Mexico is receiving only around 10% of the flow of the Colorado, they're actually using quite a bit more. And there's a substantial groundwater deficit that exists in this area, which has created a big Kona depression. We actually don't even really know its precise extent, but you can see it on the ground. And a lot of the images you'll see from Jennifer and the pulse flow sort of show what the effects of that have been on the historic riparian corridor. So in addition to being deprived of quite a bit of water, it's also been extensively dried out by groundwater pumping. So historically, the Colorado River Delta ecosystem was an enormous area. Here's Mexicali for reference. This is the Imperial Valley in the United States with the Salton Sea up here. In the sort of geologic periods, the river would sweep all around through this area and created a huge wetland. In sort of more modern times, around the turn of the century, it was mostly confined into this area, about 1.8 million acres of wetland. The ag diversions and dams in the United States, as I mentioned, took about 90% of that water away, and Mexico then developed the Mexicali Valley Agricultural District in this area, which effectively took nearly all of the water away from the Delta ecosystem. All the natural cycles were eliminated. There were very few floods after the 1960s and very few water deliveries to the Delta at all. Salinity went way up, and by the 1970s, this huge area had been reduced to maybe 40,000 acres of sort of scattered wetlands throughout the Delta, and essentially no water was reaching the historic estuary at the Gulf of California. And that had sort of predictable effects. An area which probably used to look more like this, particularly down its southern end, began to look a lot more like this, with some very significant impacts for both the ecosystem and for the cultures that had depended on that ecosystem, particularly the Kukapa who had been a sort of fishing tribe that had once depended on the Gulf fishery and the river. By that sort of period of the 1970s, the Delta was essentially believed to be a dead resource, and most folks had given up on it. But in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw some very large flow events as a result of sort of high, sort of very favorable hydrology in the United States that led to some big floods all over the Delta and resulted in a sort of miraculous regeneration of habitat throughout the Delta. And that generated a lot of interest in the environmental community as well as the academic community of whether we might be able to restore a sort of limited Delta. Wouldn't be anything like it had been historically, but you could potentially create a network of restoration sites that would provide habitat for migratory and endemic birds. You could maintain potentially some big open water areas, including the Ciénaga de Santa Clara, the marsh I mentioned earlier, which is supported by U.S. drainage water to support water birds of various kinds. And that led ultimately to an early minute between the United States and Mexico to do some scientific investigation, although at that time, essentially no commitment to actually do anything, but to at least sort of look at the problem. And a lot of great science that was done in the early 2000s, as well as the creation of a network of community-based restoration sites, mostly done by Pro Natura and the Sonoran Institute at various locations in the Delta. And ultimately, in around 2008, we formed a water trust with the express purpose of beginning to acquire water to support those sites and hopefully support something bigger. in the future. One of the early products of that was a report called Conservation Priorities in the Colorado River Delta, which began to identify some of the significant areas that could potentially be a part of that restored limited delta. This is the Cienega de Santa Clara Marsh with the drain water that comes down from the United States. This is the riparian corridor, which will be the focus of where Jennifer is going to talk about on the pulse flow. And where the restoration sites that Oswald is going to talk about are located. And this map sort of became a sort of guiding document for the NGOs, academics, and others as we began to think about how restoration in the Delta could take place. The turning point in this conversation, throughout the sort of 2000s, there was, and in the late 90s, there had been talk about how much water might be necessary to begin to do restoration in the Delta. That had really fallen on pretty much deaf ears on both sides of the border. Neither the U.S. or Mexico really recognized the Delta as a resource of any real importance. Neither side really wanted to recognize the Delta for fear that they would be the ones responsible for providing it with water if we did recognize it as a resource. But through the 2000s, with this sort of network of restoration sites and continued advocacy from the NGO community and a lot of good science, there was some increasing recognition of what we might be able to achieve there, and the fact that restoring the Delta might actually be possible without a huge amount of water. What really changed and began the process of negotiations that led to the minute was the adoption of the 2007 guidelines for reservoir management inside the United States, which were adopted really in response to the increasing risk of shortage that we were beginning to see in response to the now 15-year drought on the Colorado River. Those guidelines brought the 7 states together into a really landmark agreement to begin the conjunctive management of Lakes Powell and Meade to help control shortage risk. It set up a set of shortage triggers in Lake Meade in which the lower basin agreed to reduce use as the reservoir fell, and importantly created something known as the Intentionally Created Surplus Program, which was actually an idea that was generated in many ways out of the NGO community to allow users to begin to store water in Lake Meade to incentivize conservation. But we knew it would be important also for the for long-term efforts to restore the Delta. That agreement really significantly improved the system of management in the United States. It sort of began to address shortage as a real risk. It introduced some tools to increase flexibility in water management. But at the time, it was also recognized that it was really ultimately, if we were going to have a basin-wide approach to river management, we would need to bring Mexico into that conversation. And we would need their cooperation and involvement in an agreement of that type. That agreement actually assumed sort of unilaterally that Mexico would just participate in shortages, which Mexico wasn't terribly thrilled about, and we're certainly not consulted very extensively on. But with that recognition, in some ways, the relationship between the United States and Mexico had not yet really changed. This is a favorite map of mine. This was a map produced by the Bureau of Reclamation of the Colorado River Basin in 1974. And as you can see, the Colorado River Basin ends at the U.S.-Mexico boundary. And here's the same map in the 2007 Environmental Impact Statement in which we were evaluating the reservoir criteria. And Mexico still isn't in the Colorado River Basin. Not to be critical of reclamation. These maps, of course, had a very specific purpose. But I think they sort of do illustrate in some ways the way in which we all thought about the system, in which we really had an arm's length relationship with Mexico. To begin to overcome that, in 2007, there were a series of workshops held um, as the 2007 guidelines were coming together, in which stakeholders from both sides of the border began to get together to begin talking about how the U.S. and Mexico might collaborate on river management. And that ultimately led to the creation of a formal process known as the Joint Colorado River Cooperative Process under the auspices of the International Boundary and Water Commission and SILA in Mexico, which took a unique approach to it. It set up a series of stakeholder working groups involving a whole range of interests um, to try and sort of overcome what had been a pretty dismal relationship in the early 2000s between the U.S. and Mexico through the sort of formal diplomatic mechanisms, and really start from the ground up and begin to look at local solutions that could maybe ultimately be brought back and presented to the more formal diplomatic process. That led to, and just to put that in context, really by the mid 2000s, the U.S. and Mexico really were not talking to each other very well at all. There have been some very bad blood developed around the lining of the All-American Canal and some other issues. And it was very difficult for IBWC and SILA to make progress on something like this. These working groups were put together around issues like the environment, looking at desalination, conservation projects, system operations, changes that might be made. And those solutions were then sort of filtered up to a binational core group that was composed of representatives from the federal government, state governments, and the NGOs on both sides. What was really unprecedented about that process was the level of stakeholder involvement, particularly in Mexico, which had not had a strong history of stakeholder participation, and also the participation of the NGOs, which had really not occurred in the Colorado River Basin the same way before. That process ultimately led to the creation of 4 agreements. 3 of them, so I'll just run through briefly. Minute 316, which was an agreement around the Cienega de Santa Clara to provide water to it during the test operation of the Yuma desalting plant in the United States. Minute 317, which actually formally adopted the Joint Colorado River Cooperative Process, the stakeholder model, into the future management of the river under the treaty. And then minute 318, which was adopted in response to an earthquake in Mexico in April of 2010, which extensively destroyed infrastructure throughout the Mexicali Valley, and allowed us to take a provision of an agreement we've been working on, this, which was to allow Mexico to begin storing water in the United States through something known as the Intentionally Created Mexican Allocation Program, which we had envisioned of ultimately being part of a later agreement, but to accelerate that in order to allow Mexico to capture water that they were going to be unable to use as a result of the extensive earthquake damage. Throughout this process, U.S. and Mexico stakeholders were continuing to meet. They were beginning to learn about each other's systems. I think from both countries' perspective, the other country's infrastructure and water use was sort of a black box. In fact, there was a sort of a funny moment during this process in which, as we were exploring Mexico's use of reservoir storage, in which the Mexican commissioners insisted on getting an airplane flight over the U.S. reservoir system so that they could ensure that there, in fact, weren't more reservoirs than we were letting on. But through a lot of beer and cerveza and trust building and field trips, we made some big progress. Minute 319 was the ultimate result of that, signed in November of 2012. It's a 5-year agreement, but creates really a partnership for the management of the Colorado River. It includes a series of important provisions, an agreement to share shortages and surpluses between the countries, an agreement which allows Mexico to use U.S. reservoirs, some provisions for water exchanges, and then, of course, provisions for the restoration of the ecosystem. And importantly, The agreement itself includes a sort of explicit partnership between the U.S. states, NGOs, and the federal government as part of that on both sides of the border. That agreement is really built around an essential principle of partnership, the idea that both countries really should share in the benefits and burdens of reservoir management. And when one country is in shortage, the other should be in shortage. When one country has extra water, the other should have extra water. Not rocket science, but a breakthrough in the relationship. And of course, an agreement to provide water to the Delta ecosystem. The ICMA reservoir storage is very important for the restoration effort. Allows Mexico to store conserved water in the United States. That's particularly critical because it allows us to essentially fit the delivery of water for restoration within Mexico's allocation. Otherwise, in order to sort of produce bigger flows, you'd have to interrupt farming and other municipal uses in a way that would be unacceptable. And it creates a program which works very similar to the intentionally created surplus program inside the United States. The flow program, which Jennifer I'm sure will talk about more, set up a commitment by the U.S. and Mexico to deliver water for a pulse flow, essentially an experimental flow to the Delta. And the NGOs committed to provide a third water to match the 1/3 provided by the other governments. To support restoration sites in a base flow program and support emerging habitat that was going to be essentially planned on a binational basis through a Minute 317 environmental work group and a science process, along with a monitoring program to evaluate the results of the flow. There was money made available for restoration as part of the money that was moving between the U.S. and Mexico under the agreement. And the NGOs committed to an enormous fundraising effort to help raise money both for restoration and for the operation of the Delta Water Trust, which is providing that base flow water. So the significance of this agreement in many ways, I mean, the environmental pieces are important, the water management pieces are important. I think in some ways its greatest significance, though, is as changing the nature of the U.S.-Mexico border water relationship, which has been very troubled. The U.S.-Mexico border was established in war. And although it seems like a long time ago, in a lot of ways, it's not that long ago. And it took a long time, I mean, over another 100 years since the Mexican War, really before even the border was even agreed upon exactly where it was located. There had been a lot of arm's length relationships, very little cooperation, and very little trust. And the process of negotiations, field trips, and all of that really helped each side understand the other and recognize that there were common management challenges. Obviously, it's incredibly significant also for its commitment of water to the Delta and this joint experimental program that Jennifer will talk about. It's an issue that has real significance in Mexico. It's an important part of a narrative along the border in which the relationship with the two countries really has not been equal. And it actually stands out really as among the more than 1,000 agreements in international river management around the world. This, as far as we know, is the first one to embrace a mechanism of this type. And the agreement has actually been translated into a number of languages. We have a copy of it that was translated into Russian because Uzbekistan is looking at it as a potential way to deal with their own issues. It really was also important because of this commitment to engaging stakeholders in diplomacy. Also very unique. It was not an arm's length diplomatic process, but one that was built by stakeholders at the ground level to build solutions that made sense in a local area. And environmental organizations played an incredibly important role in that as essentially building on a lot of the relationships and assets that have been built over a decade of science and advocacy to actually help facilitate the negotiations and help bring people together. and also just having a nonprofit water trust, actually participating directly as part of the water management solution on the border. At this point, we're of course now focusing on what the next agreement looks like. Um, it's a 5-year agreement and expires in 2017. The key element really is going to be growing this binational partnership and trying to continue this stakeholder diplomacy approach. The next agreement is going to be harder to get. We're now in a situation where we have significantly growing shortage risk. Um, Getting longer term commitments of water to the Delta is going to be challenging. Um, we are potentially going to be looking at some much larger binational projects, including a desalination plant on the Pacific coast, and looking at some issues like groundwater, which we did not think about in the previous agreement. But I think the hope is that that sort of legacy of trust, understanding that's been built between the stakeholders and the sort of tremendous success of the pulse flow will provide a foundation on which we can build. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So can you tell me a little bit or inform us about the status of the desal plant in Yuma?
It's a good question. um, the desal plant has been now operated twice on a pilot basis to essentially test it. The results of those tests, I guess, demonstrated that it could operate and could, in fact, produce its function. There was some question about that after it was first constructed. It sat dormant for about 20 years after it was initially built. Um, I think it also demonstrated that it's actually quite expensive. And there is a conversation um, that soon to be underway about, in particular, what to do about the main outlet drain extension water that comes out of Yuma. That water, which is, was required to be sent away from the river under that Minute 242 agreement, um, operates essentially as a deficit in Lake Mead because it's not charged against either the United States or Mexico. And as I think you guys probably know, there's a substantial deficit in Lake Mead every year, which causes the lake to fall. As part of the memorandum of understanding that was signed in December within the United States in the lower basin, the federal government has committed to try and recover about 50,000 acre-feet of water a year, starting sort of towards the end of the memorandum, about 3 or 4 years out. Um, and to do that, they will effectively need to do something to make up some of the water lost through the main outlet drain extension. It's possible that operation of the human desalting plant will be part of that solution, although I suspect that it will not be operated in the way that it was originally envisioned to operate. There's now sort of wide recognition that the Cienega is an important resource that can't simply be dried out, which is what sort of and poisoned with salt, which would be sort of the result of operating the YDP without any controls. My guess would be that it will be, if it is operated, it'll be operated in a somewhat reduced capacity and as part of a broader, hopefully binational framework that will ensure the continued health of the Cienega, but also help control the deficit.